Inside the most infamous death camp in human history, where over 1 million people were systematically murdered, there existed something that sounds absolutely impossible: a thriving black market. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, in the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland between 1942 and 1945, prisoners weren't just fighting for survival against gas chambers and firing squads. They were negotiating, trading and bartering in an underground economy so sophisticated that a single cigarette could mean the difference between life and death. This wasn't about luxury or comfort. This was about buying one more day to breathe. And what a cigarette could purchase in that hell will change everything you thought you knew about survival in the Holocaust. When the Nazis designed Auschwitz, they engineered it to be a factory of death, a machine of industrial murder operating at maximum efficiency. The SS officers who ran the camp believed they had created a system of total control where every prisoner was stripped of dignity, identity, and hope. They shaved heads, tattooed numbers on forearms, confiscated every personal belonging, and imposed a starvation diet of watery soup and moldy bread that delivered barely 800 calories per day. The plan was simple: work the prisoners to death while feeding them just enough to extract labor, but not enough to sustain life. Within weeks, most prisoners became what the camp survivors called Muselmänner, the walking dead, skeletal figures too weak to work, too broken to hope, waiting only for the inevitable selection that would send them to the gas chambers. This was the Nazi vision of total domination, but the Nazis made one critical miscalculation. They underestimated the human will to survive. Even in Auschwitz, even under the shadow of the crematorium smokestacks that ran 24 hours a day, prisoners found ways to resist through the oldest form of human cooperation: trade. The camp, despite its walls and watchtowers and electrified fences, was not a sealed system. It was a sprawling complex, covering 15 square miles with multiple subcamps, thousands of SS guards, and a constant flow of new transports arriving daily from across occupied Europe. And wherever humans gather, even in the darkest circumstances, an economy emerges. At Auschwitz, that economy ran on cigarettes. Cigarettes became the universal currency of the camp, more valuable than gold, more precious than bread, more powerful than hope itself. A single cigarette could be traded, divided, or saved as a form of wealth that fit in the palm of your hand. But where did cigarettes come from in a place designed to strip prisoners of everything? The sources were varied and dangerous. Some came from SS guards who could be bribed or manipulated. Others arrived hidden in the personal belongings of new prisoners before they were confiscated, smuggled past inspections in the chaos of mass arrivals. The most reliable source was the Canada Commando, the work units assigned to sort through the mountains of luggage, clothing and personal items stolen from Jews and other victims as they arrived at the camp. These prisoners, working in warehouses the inmates nicknamed Canada because it seemed like a land of plenty compared to the rest of Auschwitz, had access to the last possessions of the murdered, including cigarettes, which they risked their lives to smuggle back into the camp barracks. The black market that emerged around these cigarettes was intricate and ruthlessly practical. Prices fluctuated based on supply and demand, just like any economy. But the goods being traded were the fundamental elements of survival. A single cigarette could buy an extra ladle of soup, which meant 200 additional calories that could keep you alive another day. 3 cigarettes could get you a piece of sausage from a guard's lunch. 5 cigarettes might buy you a shift away from the hardest labor details, the ones that killed men in weeks. 10 cigarettes could purchase a knife, a spoon, or a pair of shoes that actually fit. Items that sound trivial, but meant everything when frostbite and infection could send you to the gas chamber during the next selection. 20 cigarettes could buy medicine, aspirin, or bandages stolen from the camp infirmary. 50 cigarettes could potentially bribe your way into a better work assignment, one indoors, away from the killing cold of the Polish winter. But the true power of cigarettes in Auschwitz wasn't just in what they could buy. It was in what they represented. A fragment of agency in a place designed to eliminate all choice, a sliver of control in a world of absolute powerlessness, and a tool of resistance against a system built to erase humanity itself. The story of the Auschwitz black market is not a story the textbooks tell you. And it reveals a side of Holocaust survival that makes us deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to confront a truth about human nature that exists even in our darkest hour. This is that story. To understand how a black market could exist inside a death camp, you first need to understand what Auschwitz actually was in 1942, when the camp transformed from a brutal prison into the epicenter of the Nazi final solution. Auschwitz wasn't just one camp. It was a vast complex of 3 main sites and dozens of subcamps, sprawling across the Polish countryside like a small industrial city dedicated to murder. Auschwitz I was the original camp, where political prisoners and resistance fighters were worked to death. Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, was the killing center, where the gas chambers and crematoriums operated around the clock, murdering up to 8,000 people per day at the height of the Hungarian deportations in 1944. Auschwitz III, called Monowitz, was a slave labor camp built to service the IG. Farben Chemical Factory, where prisoners manufactured synthetic rubber and fuel for the Nazi war machine. Over 100,000 prisoners lived and died across this network at any given time, and managing that many human beings, even ones marked for death, required a massive infrastructure of guards, administrators, warehouses, kitchens, infirmaries, and workshops. This infrastructure created gaps, spaces where the absolute control the Nazis imagined began to crack. The SS needed prisoner labor to run the camp itself. They needed mechanics to fix machinery, electricians to maintain power systems, carpenters to build barracks, tailors to repair uniforms, cooks to prepare the starvation rations, and clerks to process the endless paperwork of mass murder. These prisoner workers, called the camp elite by other inmates, had access to resources and freedom of movement that most prisoners could never dream of. A prisoner working in the SS kitchen could steal a potato. A prisoner assigned to the carpentry shop might have access to tools that could be traded. A prisoner working in the infirmary had access to medicine and bandages. These positions were gold, and prisoners would do almost anything to secure them, because they offered the 2 things that mattered most: extra food and protection from the gas chamber selections. The camp elite became the backbone of the black market, the middlemen who connected supply with desperate demand. But they weren't the only players. The SS guards themselves, despite their ideology of racial superiority and their role as executioners, were also participants in the underground economy. Not all guards were true believers in the Nazi cause. Some were conscripted soldiers who ended up at Auschwitz through bad luck or punishment for battlefield failures. Others were opportunists who saw the camp as a chance for personal enrichment. These guards had access to everything: food from the SS kitchens, cigarettes from their rations, alcohol, warm clothing, and most importantly, they had the power to look the other way. A guard willing to trade could make a fortune by camp standards, smuggling items into the prisoner barracks, in exchange for valuables that new arrivals sometimes managed to hide from the initial confiscation. The newly arrived prisoners were the wild card in this economy, the unpredictable source of wealth that flowed into Auschwitz with every transport train. When Jews from across Europe arrived at the Birkenau selection ramp, they came with whatever they could carry: suitcases packed with clothing, family photographs, jewelry sewn into coat linings, cash hidden in shoes, diamonds swallowed and later retrieved. The Nazis confiscated all of it, sending the belongings to the Canada warehouses to be sorted, catalogued, and shipped back to Germany. But the system was chaotic, especially during the peak killing periods of 1943 and 1944, when trains arrived daily, sometimes multiple times per day, each carrying thousands of people. In that chaos, items slipped through. Prisoners working in Canada risked immediate execution to smuggle cigarettes, food, diamonds, or anything of value back into the camp, hidden in their clothes, in their shoes, or even in their mouths. This was the ecosystem that allowed the black market to flourish. A vast camp requiring complex administration, privileged prisoners with access to goods, corruptible guards willing to trade, and a constant flow of confiscated wealth from the murdered. It was an economy born from death, built on desperation, and sustained by the one truth the Nazis could never fully eliminate: the human drive to survive one more day. But what could these cigarettes actually buy? And what did those transactions reveal about the value of life itself inside the gates of hell? That's where this story becomes almost unbearable to hear. The price list of the Auschwitz black market reads like an impossible document, a ledger from hell that converts human suffering into units of trade. Survivors who documented their experiences after liberation provided detailed accounts of what items cost in cigarette currency, and these numbers reveal the brutal mathematics of survival. One cigarette, the smallest unit of trade, could purchase an extra portion of soup from a prisoner working in the kitchen detail. That soup was watery, filled with rotten vegetables and sometimes containing small chunks of horse meat, but it represented 200 additional calories that could mean the difference between having strength to stand during morning roll call or collapsing in the mud and being beaten to death by an SS guard. 2 cigarettes could buy a slice of bread, the hard black bread that was your daily ration, but never enough to satisfy the constant hunger that gnawed at every prisoner's stomach day and night. 3 to 5 cigarettes could purchase items from the SS guards who were willing to risk their careers for profit, and these transactions were the most dangerous because they required direct contact with your executioners. For 3 cigarettes, a guard might give you a piece of sausage from his personal lunch, real meat that prisoners dreamed about at night. For 5 cigarettes, you could buy margarine or a chunk of cheese, items that contained fats your starving body desperately needed to generate warmth during the Polish winters, when temperatures dropped below zero and prisoners wore only thin striped uniforms. The guards who participated in this trade weren't doing it out of compassion or humanity. They were profiting from desperation, extracting value from people they considered subhuman, and they could turn on you at any moment, taking your cigarettes and then beating you for the crime of trying to bribe an SS officer. 10 to 20 cigarettes could buy items that extended your survival in ways beyond just calories, things that addressed the other threats that killed prisoners just as surely as starvation. 10 cigarettes could purchase a pair of wooden clogs that actually fit your feet, critical, because the camp issued shoes randomly with no regard for size, and ill-fitting shoes meant blisters that became infections, that became blood poisoning, that meant selection for the gas chamber. 15 cigarettes could buy a spoon, which sounds absurd until you understand that eating the daily soup with your hands meant losing precious liquid and competing with stronger prisoners who would shove you aside. 20 cigarettes could purchase aspirin or bandages stolen from the infirmary, medicine that could bring down a fever or cover a wound, and fevers and infected wounds were death sentences because sick prisoners who couldn't work were immediately selected for extermination. 50 cigarettes represented serious wealth in the camp economy, enough to potentially bribe your way into a better work assignment or to buy information that could save your life. Prisoners who accumulated 50 cigarettes could approach the capos, the prisoner functionaries who supervised work details and had the power to assign or reassign laborers. A capo who accepted your 50 cigarettes might move you from an outdoor construction detail, where men died by the dozens every week from exhaustion and exposure, to an indoor workshop where you assembled munitions or sorted clothing, work that was still brutal but didn't involve standing motionless for hours in sub-zero temperatures. 50 cigarettes could also buy intelligence, warnings about upcoming selections, when the SS doctors would walk through the barracks choosing prisoners who looked too weak or too sick to be worth the cost of their rations, sending them to the gas chambers to make room for fresh slave labor arriving on the next transport. But the most expensive transactions in the Auschwitz black market weren't about comfort or even about survival for another week or month. They were about identity, dignity, and maintaining some fragment of your humanity in a place designed to strip all 3 away. 100 cigarettes or more could buy you a photograph of your family that you managed to hide from confiscation, a connection to who you were before you became a number tattooed on your forearm. 200 cigarettes could purchase a religious item, a prayer book or a makeshift Star of David, objects that had no practical survival value but represented spiritual resistance against a regime trying to erase your existence. The most extraordinary transactions involved prisoners pooling their cigarette wealth together, to bribe guards to smuggle letters out of the camp or to bring news from the outside world about the progress of the war, information that fed the desperate hope that liberation might come before death did. These prices reveal something profound. Even in Auschwitz, humans needed more than just food to survive. They needed hope, connection, and meaning. The mechanics of how these transactions actually happened reveals just how dangerous and sophisticated the Auschwitz black market truly was. Every exchange was a calculated risk that could result in immediate execution if discovered by the wrong SS guard or reported by an informant among the prisoners. The transactions typically occurred during the brief windows of relative chaos that punctuated the camp's otherwise rigid schedule. During the evening return from work details, when thousands of prisoners flooded back through the gates and the guards couldn't watch everyone simultaneously. During the distribution of evening rations, when prisoners crowded around the soup kettles and brief conversations could happen unnoticed. Or during the night, in the barracks after lights out, when darkness provided cover for whispered negotiations and hand-to-hand transfers. Prisoners developed an elaborate system of signals and codes to indicate they had goods to trade or needed to buy something. A specific way of arranging your bowl at mealtime might signal you had cigarettes to spend. A particular phrase muttered in passing could indicate you were looking for medicine or food. The most successful black market operators were prisoners who held positions that gave them mobility within the camp and access to both supplies and customers. The prisoners assigned to the Canada work detail were the aristocrats of this underground economy because they processed the belongings of the murdered and could smuggle items with relative ease compared to other prisoners. They worked in massive warehouses, sorting through mountains of suitcases, clothing, eyeglasses, shoes, and personal items, and despite the presence of SS supervisors and the threat of random searches, they managed to hide cigarettes in their clothing, in their wooden clogs, under their caps, or even in their mouths to smuggle back to the barracks. These Canada prisoners became wealthy by camp standards, and they used that wealth not just for personal survival, but to build networks of obligation and protection, trading cigarettes for favors from capos who could shield them from brutal labor assignments or providing goods to prisoner doctors who might save them if they got sick. The prisoner functionaries, the capos and block elders who supervise barracks and work details, were another crucial node in the black market network. These prisoners, usually selected for their physical strength or willingness to collaborate with the SS, had power that was both absolute and precarious. They could beat other prisoners to death with impunity, control access to better sleeping positions in the overcrowded barracks, and determine who got assigned to the killing work details and who got relatively easier jobs. Many capos were brutal collaborators who used their position to torture fellow prisoners, but others operated in moral gray zones, using the black market to build systems of patronage that kept prisoners alive. A capo who accepted cigarettes from prisoners in exchange for better treatment was still participating in an exploitative system, but in Auschwitz, that exploitation might be the only thing standing between a prisoner and death. The ethical calculations were impossible. Was a capo who took bribes but also protected his barracks from the worst SS violence a villain or a savior? There were no clean answers. The SS guards who participated in the black market represented the most dangerous and unpredictable element of the entire system. These men held absolute power over life and death, and trading with them was like making deals with the devil himself. Some guards were reliable business partners who honored the unspoken rules of exchange. You gave them cigarettes or valuables, they provided food or protection, and both sides benefited. But other guards were predators who would take your payment and then report you for attempting to bribe an SS officer, an offense punishable by public hanging as a warning to other prisoners. Prisoners had to carefully assess which guards could be approached and which ones were too fanatical or too sadistic to risk contact. The prisoners who survived longest learned to read the guards like predators, identifying the ones who were corrupt and greedy versus the true believers who would kill you for the ideological crime of trying to assert your humanity through trade. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Auschwitz black market was how it forced prisoners into impossible moral compromises that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. When you traded cigarettes for an extra portion of soup, you were potentially taking food from another starving prisoner who needed it just as desperately. When you bribed a capo to get a better work assignment, someone else got sent to the stone quarry or the construction detail where death came quickly. When prisoners working in Canada smuggled goods to trade, they were profiting directly from the belongings of people who had just been murdered in the gas chambers, wearing dead children's shoes and trading dead mothers' cigarettes. Survival in Auschwitz required participating in a system built on death, and that participation created profound guilt that many survivors carried forever. The black market kept people alive, but it also forced them to make choices that violated every moral principle they had held before entering the camp gates. This was another layer of Nazi cruelty, creating conditions where survival itself required you to become complicit in the machinery of death. The cigarette economy of Auschwitz operated according to the same principles that govern any marketplace: supply and demand, scarcity and abundance, inflation and deflation. But the factors that influenced prices in this market were uniquely horrific, tied directly to the rhythms of mass murder and the efficiency of the Nazi killing machine. When trains arrived frequently from Hungary in the spring and summer of 1944, bringing over 400,000 Jews to Birkenau in just 8 weeks, the Canada warehouses overflowed with confiscated belongings, and cigarettes flooded into the camp economy. During these periods, prices dropped dramatically because supply exceeded demand, and a prisoner might be able to buy an extra ration of bread for just 1 cigarette instead of 2. But when the transport slowed during winter months, or when Allied bombing disrupted the railway networks bringing victims to the camp, cigarette supplies dried up and prices skyrocketed, with that same piece of bread now costing 5 cigarettes or more. The market responded to genocide with the cold logic of supply curves and price equilibrium. The physical condition of the prisoner population also influenced the market in ways that revealed the brutal hierarchy of survival inside the camp. New arrivals, fresh off the transport trains, still had some physical strength and mental clarity, and they entered the black market as desperate buyers willing to trade anything for information about how to survive their first weeks. These prisoners, if they had managed to smuggle in any valuables during the initial confiscation, would pay premium prices for basic survival knowledge, which capos to avoid, which work details meant quick death, how to stand during selections to appear healthy and strong. But within weeks, most of these prisoners became Muselmänner, too weak and starved to participate in any economic activity, reduced to waiting for death. The market had no use for them anymore. Meanwhile, the camp elite, the prisoners who had survived for months or even years, became increasingly wealthy in relative terms, accumulating cigarettes and goods that gave them margins of safety that newer prisoners could never achieve. Seasonal changes transformed the market priorities in ways that would seem absurd in any normal economy, but made perfect sense in Auschwitz. During the brutal Polish winters, when temperatures plunged far below freezing and prisoners stood for hours during morning and evening roll calls, wearing only thin, striped uniforms, the most valuable commodities shifted from food to warmth. A sweater or an extra shirt became worth 30 cigarettes or more, because freezing to death was just as certain as starving to death, and it happened faster. Prisoners traded food for clothing, making the calculated gamble that they could survive a few more days of hunger, if it meant not dying of exposure during the next night. When spring arrived and temperatures rose, the market shifted again, with food prices climbing as the immediate threat of freezing diminished. These seasonal fluctuations created opportunities for prisoners who could think strategically, hoarding warm clothes during summer when prices were low and trading them for enormous profits when winter arrived. The Nazi camp administration, despite their belief in total control, couldn't fully suppress the black market because doing so would have required eliminating the very prisoner labor force they needed to run the camp infrastructure. The SS knew the black market existed. They conducted random searches, they executed prisoners caught trading, they used informants to identify the major operators. But they also tacitly accepted that some level of underground economy was inevitable and perhaps even useful, because it gave prisoners hope that they could improve their situation through effort and cunning, which made them more compliant and easier to manage. A prisoner who believed he could trade his way to survival was a prisoner who would keep working, keep following orders, and keep the camp machinery running smoothly. The black market was simultaneously an act of resistance against Nazi dehumanization and a tool that helped the death camp function more efficiently. This paradox was quintessentially Auschwitz, where every aspect of existence contained impossible contradictions. The stories of individual transactions reveal the human dimension behind these economic abstractions, and some of these stories demonstrate acts of extraordinary compassion within the framework of market exchange. Prisoners sometimes traded cigarettes not to benefit themselves but to save others, pooling resources to buy medicine for a sick friend or bribing a capo to protect a family member from selection. A prisoner who worked in the kitchen might deliberately overfill soup portions for starving inmates, accepting cigarettes not as payment but as a token that created obligation and connection. There were even documented cases of prisoners using cigarette wealth to organize small acts of sabotage against the Nazi war effort, bribing civilian workers to smuggle explosives into the camp that were later used in the October 1944 Sonderkommando uprising, when prisoners assigned to operate the gas chambers and crematoriums rebelled, destroyed one of the crematorium buildings, and killed several SS guards before being gunned due. So these transactions weren't just about survival. They were about maintaining humanity, building solidarity, and resisting even when resistance seemed futile. The prisoner testimonies collected after liberation provide specific, haunting details about what cigarettes could buy beyond food and clothing, revealing a shadow economy that addressed every conceivable human need in the camp. One survivor documented that 3 cigarettes could purchase a haircut from a prisoner barber, which might seem like vanity in a death camp, but was actually critical because lice infestations spread typhus, and a typhus diagnosis meant immediate selection for the gas chamber. 5 cigarettes could buy a shave, important because maintaining some grooming helped you appear healthier during selections when SS doctors made split-second decisions about who lived and who died based purely on physical appearance. 10 cigarettes could purchase eyeglasses stolen from the Canada warehouses, and for prisoners whose vision had deteriorated from malnutrition and vitamin deficiency, glasses could mean the difference between being able to work effectively and being classified as useless and sent to extermination. Even something as seemingly trivial as a comb, costing 2 cigarettes, had survival value because it helped remove lice and allowed prisoners to maintain a minimal sense of dignity and self-care that psychologically separated them from the Muselmänner who had given up all hope. The medical black market within Auschwitz represented perhaps the most critical sector of the underground economy, because illness in the camp was essentially a death sentence unless you could access treatment that the official camp infirmary rarely provided. The SS camp doctors performed selections in the infirmary regularly, murdering sick prisoners to free up beds and reduce the burden of caring for those who couldn't work. This created massive demand for private medical care provided by prisoner doctors who used smuggled or stolen supplies. 20 cigarettes could buy a consultation with a prisoner doctor who might diagnose your illness and recommend treatment. 30 cigarettes could purchase aspirin or fever reducers that could bring down a temperature enough to avoid detection during selections. 50 cigarettes or more could buy antibiotics or sulfur drugs stolen from SS medical supplies, medications that could cure infections that would otherwise kill you. 100 cigarettes could potentially bribe a prisoner doctor to falsify medical records, changing your status from sick to healthy, or hiding you in the infirmary during a selection. These transactions created an entire parallel medical system where prisoners with cigarette wealth received real health care, while those without simply died. The black market also facilitated communication with the outside world, transactions that were extraordinarily dangerous, but psychologically essential for maintaining hope. Prisoners who worked in areas of the camp that had contact with civilian Polish workers employed by German companies operating at Auschwitz could sometimes arrange for letters to be smuggled out, but the cost was enormous. 200 cigarettes or more might convince a civilian worker to risk carrying a letter outside the camp and mailing it to family members or resistance organizations. The prisoner sending the letter risked torture and execution if caught. The civilian worker risked arrest by the Gestapo, but these letters served multiple purposes beyond personal connection. They informed the outside world about what was happening inside Auschwitz, at a time when many people still didn't fully understand the scope of the Holocaust. They occasionally allowed prisoners to send information to Jewish resistance organizations about camp operations, And they provided the sender with something priceless, proof that they still existed as a human being with a name and a history and people who loved them, not just a number waiting to be erased. Information itself became a tradable commodity in the Auschwitz black market, with different types of intelligence commanding different cigarette prices depending on how valuable the knowledge was for survival. 5 to 10 cigarettes could buy you information about which work details were the easiest and which were death sentences, crucial knowledge for new arrivals trying to navigate their first days. 20 cigarettes could purchase advance warning about upcoming selections, giving you time to prepare by pinching your cheeks to create color, standing up straight despite exhaustion, and positioning yourself in areas where you were less likely to be noticed by the SS doctors making their rounds. 50 cigarettes might buy information about which capos were approachable for bribes and which ones would kill you for trying. 100 cigarettes or more could purchase intelligence about the progress of the war, news smuggled into the camp by civilian workers or occasionally by SS guards who had heard radio broadcasts. This information was psychologically vital because it fed hope that the Nazi regime might be losing the war and that liberation might eventually come, hope that kept some prisoners alive when their bodies should have given up. Perhaps the most morally complex transactions in the Auschwitz black market involved buying and selling work assignments, because these exchanges directly determined who would survive and who would die. A prisoner with cigarette wealth could bribe a capo to assign them to a coveted indoor position, sorting clothing in the Canada warehouses or working in an administrative office, positions that offered protection from weather, less physically demanding labor, and access to resources. But every good assignment given to one prisoner meant another prisoner got sent to the stone quarry, the gravel pit, or the construction details where men lasted weeks before dying from exhaustion. The prisoner who bought safety was directly benefiting from another prisoner's death sentence, and this reality created profound moral anguish. Survivors struggled with this guilt for decades after liberation, haunted by the memory of trading cigarettes to save themselves while knowing someone else died in their place. The black market forced prisoners to make Sophie's choices every single day, decisions where there were no right answers, and where survival required betraying the basic human principle that all lives have equal value. This was the ultimate Nazi cruelty, creating a system where staying alive required you to participate in the selection of who would die. The autumn of 1944 marked a critical turning point in the Auschwitz black market, when the entire underground economy reached its peak of complexity and desperation as the Nazi regime began to unravel. By October of that year, the Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east, Allied forces were pushing through France and Belgium from the west, and even the SS guards at Auschwitz could sense that Germany was losing the war. The transports of Hungarian Jews that had flooded the camp with new victims and new wealth during the summer had largely ended, which meant the supply of cigarettes and tradable goods was decreasing just as demand was increasing. Prisoners who had survived for years understood that they were in a race against time. They needed to stay alive just a few more months until liberation, but those final months might be the most dangerous because the Nazis were accelerating the pace of murder, trying to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence of their crimes before the Allies arrived. The black market adapted to these new conditions with a shift in what prisoners valued most, moving away from short-term survival goods toward items that might help them escape or survive the chaos of the camp's final days. The price of information about escape routes and safe hiding places skyrocketed during this period, with prisoners willing to pay hundreds of cigarettes for intelligence that might save them during the anticipated Nazi evacuation of the camp. Rumors spread through the barracks that the SS planned to march all remaining prisoners westward into Germany before the Soviets could liberate Auschwitz, and prisoners correctly understood that these death marches would kill thousands through exposure, exhaustion, and execution of anyone who couldn't keep pace. The black market responded with a new commodity: maps and information about the surrounding Polish countryside, knowledge about which Polish villages might hide escaped prisoners versus which ones would turn Jews over to the Germans, and intelligence about partisan resistance groups operating in the forests who might provide protection. Prisoners pooled their cigarette wealth to bribe Polish civilian workers for detailed information about geography and safe routes, creating informal resistance networks that were preparing for the collapse of Nazi control. Some prisoners began trading for civilian clothing stolen from the Canada warehouses, garments that could help them blend in with Polish refugees if they managed to escape during the confusion of evacuation. The medical black market also evolved during this final period, with a dramatic increase in demand for medications that could help prisoners survive typhus and dysentery, diseases that were spreading rapidly through the overcrowded camp as sanitation systems collapsed and the SS reduced food rations even further. Typhus was particularly devastating in the autumn and winter of 1944 because it spread through lice in the cramped barracks where prisoners slept 3 or 4 to a wooden bunk with no room to move. The official camp infirmary, which had always been more of a death factory than a hospital, became completely overwhelmed and stopped even pretending to provide treatment. Prisoner doctors operating in the black market became the only source of real medical care, but their prices increased dramatically as supplies of stolen medications dwindled. What had cost 30 cigarettes in the summer now cost 100 or more, pricing out the majority of prisoners who had no cigarette wealth and condemning them to die from treatable illnesses just months before liberation would have saved them. The cruelty of dying from typhus in December 1944, when Soviet forces were less than 100 miles away, was a special kind of torture that haunted survivors who witnessed friends and family members perish within sight of freedom. The relationship between prisoners and SS guards also transformed during this final period, creating bizarre situations where guards who had been executioners began positioning themselves as potential saviors, using the black market to buy insurance for their own post-war survival. Some guards, understanding that they would face war crimes prosecution if Germany lost, began approaching prisoners with extraordinary offers. They would provide food, medicine, or protection in exchange for promises that the prisoners would testify on their behalf after liberation, claiming the guard had been kind or had helped save lives. These transactions were surreal reversals of the camp's power dynamics, with SS men who had murdered thousands suddenly desperate to accumulate evidence of good behavior. Prisoners faced impossible calculations about whether to participate in these deals. The food and medicine offered by guards trying to buy post-war clemency could save your life in the immediate term, but accepting it meant potentially helping a war criminal escape justice. Some prisoners took the deals and then ignored their promises after liberation. Others refused on principle, choosing to risk death rather than give murderers any hope of redemption. There were no easy moral answers in these final months. The October 19, 1944 Sonderkommando uprising demonstrated how the black market could facilitate not just survival, but active resistance against the Nazi machinery of death. The Sonderkommando were the prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers and crematoriums, men who knew they would eventually be murdered themselves to eliminate witnesses to the mass extermination. These prisoners had access to the belongings of the dead, which gave them cigarette wealth they used to bribe civilian workers, and female prisoners working in the camp munitions factory to smuggle explosives into the crematorium area over many months. The uprising itself was a desperate act that ended with nearly all the rebels killed, but they succeeded in destroying Crematorium 4 and killing several SS guards, proving that even in Auschwitz, even among prisoners working in the heart of the killing operation, resistance was possible. The black market had provided the tools for that resistance, converting cigarettes into gunpowder and transforming an underground economy of survival into a weapon of defiance. This was the black market's ultimate expression, not just keeping prisoners alive, but giving them the means to fight back against their executioners, even when that fight was hopeless and would end in death. It represented the final refusal to accept the Nazi vision of Jewish powerlessness and passivity. January 1945 brought the final collapse of the Auschwitz black market as the camp descended into absolute chaos during the last weeks before evacuation. The Soviet offensive launched on January 12th, pushed rapidly westward, and by mid-January, the Red Army was within 20 miles of the camp. The SS began frantically destroying evidence of their crimes, dynamiting the remaining gas chambers and crematoriums, burning documents, and preparing to evacuate approximately 60,000 prisoners westward into Germany before the Soviets could liberate the camp. During this final period, the black market experienced hyperinflation that made cigarettes nearly worthless, because what prisoners needed now wasn't food or medicine, but the means to survive evacuation or the courage to hide and wait for liberation. The normal rules of the camp economy broke down completely. Prisoners with cigarette wealth found they couldn't buy safety anymore because the guards themselves were panicking, more concerned with their own survival than with maintaining control. The careful networks of exchange that had sustained the black market for years disintegrated within days, as the camp transformed from an organized system of murder into an apocalyptic nightmare of abandonment and chaos. The death marches that began on January 18th created a final horrific market transaction, where cigarettes bought almost nothing but human compassion, occasionally manifested in ways that transcended economic exchange. The SS forced approximately 60,000 prisoners to march westward through the frozen Polish winter toward other concentration camps deeper in German territory, and anyone who fell behind or couldn't maintain the pace was shot immediately and left in the snow. Prisoners who had hoarded cigarettes for years discovered their wealth was meaningless on the march because there was nothing to buy and no one to buy from. Guards weren't interested in bribes anymore. They were focused on moving the columns quickly and eliminating witnesses. The few transactions that occurred during the death marches were mostly between prisoners themselves, acts of desperate sharing rather than formal trades. A prisoner with a hidden piece of bread might share it with a friend, not in exchange for cigarettes, but because maintaining human bonds was the only thing separating them from complete animal desperation. The black market had always operated on a combination of self-interest and solidarity, but during the death marches, self-interest became suicidal and solidarity became the only survival strategy. Approximately 9,000 prisoners, recognizing that the death marches were essentially mobile execution operations, made the calculated decision to hide in the camp rather than evacuate, gambling that they could survive a few more days until Soviet liberation even without food or heat. These prisoners, many of them sick or weak, concealed themselves in attics, cellars, latrines and abandoned barracks as the SS conducted final sweeps. The black market made one last appearance during this hiding period, with the camp's remaining cigarette wealth being used to buy silence and cooperation from fellow prisoners who knew about hiding places. A prisoner who discovered someone hiding in their barracks faced a choice: report them to the SS for potential reward, ignore them and risk collective punishment if they were discovered, or actively help them survive by sharing scraps of food or providing warnings about SS patrols. Some prisoners demanded cigarette payment for their silence, extracting final profits from desperate people. Others helped unconditionally, recognizing that the normal rules of survival no longer applied and that human decency was the only thing they had left to offer. The hidden prisoners lived in darkness without food or water, listening to the sounds of explosions as the SS destroyed evidence and the distant rumble of Soviet artillery getting closer each day. The Soviet liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, revealed the full cost of the black market's failure in the camp's final weeks. The Soviet soldiers found approximately 7,000 survivors, nearly all of them sick, starving, and near death. These were the prisoners who had hidden successfully or who had been too weak to evacuate and had been abandoned by the SS. The liberators discovered warehouses still full of goods stolen from murdered prisoners, tons of human hair, mountains of shoes, thousands of eyeglasses, and yes, enormous quantities of cigarettes that had never made it into the black market circulation. The photographs taken by Soviet military photographers show skeletal figures wrapped in blankets, barely able to stand, their eyes haunted by what they had witnessed and survived. These survivors had cigarette wealth meant nothing in those final days. The sophisticated economy they had built to navigate survival had collapsed completely, proving that the black market had always been a fragile adaptation to impossible circumstances rather than a true path to safety. Liberation came not through cigarettes or bribes or clever trades, but through the military defeat of Nazi Germany, a defeat these prisoners had prayed for but never been certain they would live to see. The immediate aftermath of liberation created a bizarre reversal of the camp's economic system, where cigarettes suddenly flooded back into circulation but lost most of their survival value because the threat of death had been removed. Soviet soldiers and later American and British aid workers brought real cigarettes, food and medicine into the camp to help survivors recover, and for the first time in years, prisoners had access to resources without having to trade or bribe or compromise their humanity. But the psychological patterns established by years of black market survival didn't disappear immediately. Survivors hoarded food compulsively, unable to trust that meals would continue coming. They hid supplies under mattresses and in pockets, behaviors that would persist for decades. Some survivors felt guilty about the relative abundance, remembering friends who had died just weeks earlier from starvation that could now be easily prevented. The transition from the brutal scarcity economics of Auschwitz to the comparative plenty of the post-liberation period was psychologically traumatic in its own way, forcing survivors to confront how arbitrary their survival had been and how many people had died simply because they didn't have cigarettes to trade at the right moment. The black market had saved some lives, but it had also created a system where survival depended on resources and luck rather than human worth, and that knowledge would haunt the survivors forever. The psychological aftermath of the Auschwitz black market haunted survivors for the rest of their lives in ways that were often more difficult to process than the physical horrors they had endured. Survivors struggled with profound guilt about the transactions they had made to stay alive, the moral compromises they had accepted, and the people who had died so they could survive. Primo Levi, one of the most famous Auschwitz survivors and chroniclers of the camp experience, wrote extensively about what he called the gray zone, the moral ambiguity that characterized life in the camp, where traditional ethical categories of good and evil became meaningless. Levi described how the black market forced prisoners to make calculations that would have been unthinkable in normal life, trading away food that another starving person desperately needed, bribing capos who used that wealth to further oppress other prisoners, or profiting from goods stolen from people who had just been murdered. These weren't choices between good and evil, but choices between different kinds of complicity, and survivors carried the weight of those decisions for decades. Many experienced recurring nightmares about the trades they had made, waking up terrified that they had somehow caused another person's death by buying an extra ration of soup or bribing their way into a better work assignment. The economic behaviors learned in Auschwitz also manifested in survivors' post-war lives in ways that seemed incomprehensible to people who hadn't experienced the camp. Survivors hoarded food compulsively, filling pantries and freezers far beyond any reasonable need, unable to overcome the fear that starvation might return at any moment. They developed obsessive relationships with money and possessions, simultaneously unable to throw anything away and unable to enjoy what they had accumulated. Children of survivors reported growing up in homes where bread was never wasted, where every scrap of food was saved and reused, where the idea of throwing away a cigarette butt would have been unthinkable. These behaviors were survival adaptations from Auschwitz that became maladaptive in normal society, but survivors couldn't simply turn them off. The black market had taught them that everything had value, that waste meant death, and that you could never have enough resources to guarantee safety. These lessons had been burned into their psyches at a neurological level through years of trauma, and they shaped survivors' relationships with material goods for the rest of their lives. The social dynamics established by the black market also created lasting hierarchies and resentments among survivor communities that persisted long after liberation. Prisoners who had held privileged positions in the camp, who had worked in Canada or served as capos or had access to the black market supply chains, often survived at higher rates than ordinary prisoners. This created a survivor population that was disproportionately composed of people who had been camp elites, and their survival sometimes came with accusations of collaboration or moral compromise. After the war, survivor communities engaged in painful debates about who deserved to be considered a hero and who should be condemned as a collaborator. Some former capos were ostracized or even prosecuted for war crimes because they had beaten and killed other prisoners while enforcing SS orders. But other capos argued they had used their positions to save lives, protecting prisoners from worse fates, and using black market networks to distribute food and medicine. These debates had no clear resolutions, because the reality was complex. The same person could have saved some prisoners while condemning others to death, and judging their actions required understanding impossible moral calculations made under threat of immediate execution. The historical documentation of the Auschwitz black market came primarily from survivor testimonies recorded in the decades after liberation, and these accounts reveal how difficult it was for survivors to talk about their economic activities in the camp. Many survivors felt deep shame about admitting they had participated in black market transactions, fearing they would be judged as selfish or immoral for trading while others starved. Early Holocaust histories often sanitized survivor experiences, presenting victims as purely innocent and helpless rather than acknowledging the complex agency and difficult choices that characterized actual camp life. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, when historians began conducting more detailed oral history projects, that the full scope of the black market became documented. Survivors like Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, and others wrote honestly about the moral complexity of survival, describing the trades they had made and the guilt they carried. These testimonies were invaluable not just as historical records, but as attempts at moral reckoning, efforts by survivors to process their experiences and to help the world understand that survival in Auschwitz required becoming someone different from who you had been before, someone capable of moral calculations that would have been unthinkable in normal life. The economic analysis of the Auschwitz black market also provided scholars with insights into human behavior under extreme conditions that had implications far beyond Holocaust studies. Economists studying the camp's cigarette currency documented how even in the most brutal circumstances, humans create economic systems based on trade, specialization, and rational choice. The Auschwitz market demonstrated that economic behavior is fundamental to human nature, emerging even in places designed to eliminate all human agency. But these economic analyses also triggered controversies because they risked reducing profound human suffering to abstract models of supply and demand, treating the Holocaust as merely an interesting natural experiment in scarcity economics. Survivors and Holocaust scholars pushed back against purely economic interpretations, insisting that the black market must be understood primarily as a moral and human story rather than just an economic phenomenon. The cigarette trades weren't just market transactions, but desperate attempts to maintain humanity, assert agency, and resist the Nazi program of total dehumanization. The black market mattered not because it illustrated economic principles, but because it revealed the depths of human resilience and the terrible costs of survival in a system designed to destroy both body and soul. Understanding that distinction was essential to honoring the memory of those who died and respecting the experiences of those who survived. The story of the Auschwitz black market forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about survival, morality, and human nature that challenge our comfortable narratives about the Holocaust. We want to believe that in the face of absolute evil, victims remained purely innocent, that resistance was always heroic, and that moral clarity existed even in the darkest places. But the reality was far more complex and far more human. The prisoners who traded cigarettes for soup weren't greedy or selfish. They were desperate people trying to survive one more day in conditions designed to kill them. The capos who accepted bribes weren't simply collaborators. They were prisoners themselves, operating in impossible gray zones where every choice involved moral compromise. The black market wasn't a stain on Holocaust history that should be hidden or sanitized. It was a testament to human resilience, creativity, and the refusal to surrender agency, even when every force in the universe was aligned to strip it away. Understanding this complexity doesn't diminish the evil of the Holocaust or excuse the crimes of the perpetrators. Instead, it honors the full humanity of the victims by acknowledging the impossible choices they faced and the extraordinary courage required simply to keep living. This history matters today because the Auschwitz black market reveals fundamental truths about how humans behave under extreme conditions of scarcity, violence, and authoritarian control. The economic principles that governed cigarette trades in Auschwitz, the same principles of supply and demand, risk and reward, trust and betrayal, continue to operate in refugee camps, in prisons, in war zones, and in any situation where people are deprived of basic needs and forced to create informal systems of survival. The moral questions that haunted Auschwitz survivors, questions about when self-preservation becomes selfishness, when cooperation becomes collaboration, and when survival requires unacceptable compromise, are questions that persist in every humanitarian crisis. By studying the Auschwitz black market, we learn not just about the Holocaust, but about the extremes of human adaptability and the terrible costs of systems that force people to compete for resources necessary for life. These lessons are not abstract historical curiosities. They are urgent reminders of what happens when societies abandon their most vulnerable people to conditions of absolute scarcity and violence. The reason this story remained largely untold for decades after the Holocaust wasn't because historians didn't know about the black market, but because it complicated the narratives that both survivors and society wanted to tell about the camps. Survivors often felt shame about their participation in economic activities that required moral compromise, and they feared being judged harshly by people who had never faced such impossible choices. Society preferred simpler stories of pure victims and evil perpetrators, narratives that allowed for clear moral lessons without the uncomfortable ambiguity of the gray zone. But suppressing this complexity does a disservice to both historical truth and to the memory of those who died. The prisoners who traded cigarettes to survive deserve to be remembered as fully human, complete with the moral complexity that humanity entails. Their resourcefulness, their networks of solidarity, and their refusal to passively accept death were all forms of resistance against a system designed to erase their humanity. The black market was survival, resistance, and moral tragedy all at once, and it deserves to be understood in all its uncomfortable complexity. What a cigarette could buy in Auschwitz was never just soup or medicine or a pair of shoes that fit. What it bought was time, agency, hope, and a fragment of human dignity in a place designed to destroy all four. It bought one more day of life in a lottery where survival was never guaranteed and where living often meant carrying guilt that would last a lifetime. It bought connection in a world of isolation, resistance in a system of total control, and humanity in the heart of hell itself. That's the story they didn't teach you in school, the truth hidden in the footnotes of Holocaust history. And it's a story that demands to be told and remembered, not despite its moral complexity, but because of it. Because if we can't face the full truth of what humans endured and how they survived in the darkest chapter of modern history, then we haven't really learned anything at all from the 6 million who died and the thousands who lived to tell their stories. Remember their names, remember their struggles, remember that survival sometimes required becoming someone you never wanted to be. And remember that even in Auschwitz, even when reduced to numbers and stripped of everything, human beings refused to surrender their humanity completely. That refusal, purchased one cigarette at a time, is the legacy that must never be forgotten.